Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited to talk to you because I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. And you've been the person that I'm like, okay, what's Scott tweeting about whenever we have news on tariffs? I go to
Yeah.
your Twitter page. And I'm really curious, what you're thinking about where we're at with the tariffs now. They're trying to negotiate, 90 deals in 90 days. And President Trump has said that part of the reason that he wants to do these tariffs, it seems to be to undo some element of globalization. So how
Yeah.
are you thinking about, number one, the tariffs that we're seeing, and number two, the goal of undoing globalization?
Yeah. The tariffs are a mess. The reality is that, Trump likes tariffs. He always has liked tariffs. And I think we all expected some increase in the US tariff rate on average and specific actions targeting China and autos and pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, that kind of stuff. So, in that sense, pretty much expected. But all this other stuff, the reciprocal tariffs, that crazy formula they threw out there to calculate them, 90 countries in 90 days, trade deals. This is trade madness. In the biz, you would look at this and go, oh, what are we doing, right?
Mhm.
And I think has shocked markets, has shocked analysts like me because markets are all about expectations, right? And the expectation, especially among like the big banks and stuff, was that you'd see some increase, but not what we've gotten. The other though big shock is the uncertainty around all of it, because the first Trump term we had some tariffs, but they took a while and they were telegraphed. So you had about $80 billion in new tariffs per year, give or take, per certain estimates. But it took about 2.5 years to implement those. This time around, you're getting almost 800 billion in tariffs, and in 2.5 months. So basically 10 times the tariffs, 10 times as fast, and that's just shocking. Along with then the carve outs and the exemptions and the pauses, and trying to invest in this market. If you're a CEO planning a major new expansion, or if you think, oh well, the United States is now protectionist, we need to invest in the United States. All this stuff makes it pretty much impossible. So, I think again, the technical term is a mess, and it reflects some disagreement in among White House staff. It appears, and also just this time around, there just aren't moderating influences on the president's impulses like there were last time. Ones that said, let's go through a process, let's do notice and comment, let's talk to the businesses. No, this is just let's go. And unfortunately, the laws allow for that, and Congress hasn't taken back some of its tariff powers. Um, on your second point about globalization, no, first, globalization is often talked about as some sort of thing that was, created in like Davos by Larry Summers and Milton Friedman and some other, maybe George Soros is there too, and they just thrust it upon the world in the 1990s. But the reality is that people have been trading across long distances and migrating across long distances since the dawn of recorded history. The only things that have changed in the last, 40 years or so is that it's become much easier to trade thanks to the internet and a bunch of other technologies, containerized shipping and all this. And governments have gotten out of the way to some extent. So they've, enacted trade agreements, or they've unilaterally liberalized trade barriers after a long period of experimenting with protectionism and industrial policy and just finding that it didn't work very well. And that's particularly the case in the US. Um, and going back even further, some of the liberalization is related to foreign policy, right? We got into a couple world wars in part because countries got into these rival trading blocs, and they decided to get out of that by liberalizing, entering into the what's now the World Trade Organization and that kind of stuff. So, um, that's not going away. The fact is that even with, having extremely protectionist rhetoric in the White House and during the Biden White House as well, quite frankly, inflation adjusted imports into the United States hit an all time high last year.
Wow.
Governments around the world, except for the United States, are still signing free trade agreements to liberalize trade with each other. Um, the DHL does this great global connectivity index that looks at all these different measures of global economic activity, and it's hovering at its all-time high right now. Even the World Trade Organization's very pessimistic global trade report shows a very modest 1-2% contraction in global trade this year. That's just crazy given all of this stuff we're hearing, right? So that, I think, gets back to the reality that uh, people on the ground still want to do this. We want our cheap stuff. We want to watch Squid Game on Netflix. We want to eat at an Indian restaurant or whatever. There's all these aspects of globalization that are going to stick around. And I think on the corporate side, look, global supply chains are not going anywhere. They're just too complex and too efficient. What you're going to see, I think, more than anything is just companies again trying to navigate around Donald Trump, particularly given that other governments don't seem to be following his lead.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Japan at least tried to negotiate and they went to the table and the Trump administration was like, we don't know what we
Yeah,
want.
yeah.
So, is there even a possibility for any of this to go away? Like, it just feels like nobody wants it except for the administration. Other countries are quite upset with us. Like, what do you think the end state is here?
I think we're in for a rough few years. But
Mm.
I also think that I'm expecting increased moderation over the next, few months. Donald Trump says he doesn't care about the stock market, but then he let it slip, right? That it was the bond market turmoil that helped him, uh, pushed him to announce the big pause that caused markets to skyrocket. And I do think that uh, the mess that we've seen has allowed for some of the more moderate voices in the Trump administration to exert themselves and be more influential. So Scott Bessent, the Treasury
Mhm.
Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, so they seem to be ascendant. Peter Navarro, the very protectionist advisor, who's a bit of a Rasputin type, whispering in Trump's ear, and is
Yeah.
very good at apparently being like the last guy Trump talks to before he sends some Truth Social post. Um, but Navarro seems to have been not excommunicated, but relegated a bit. So that to me, along with the these deals, strikes me that we're going to get a little more moderation. But um, look, again, going back to my central thesis that Trump likes tariffs and has surrounded himself with people who like tariffs and truly sees trade balances as scorecards for who's winning and losing in trade. Yes, I'm glad you're shaking your head there,
It's crazy.
but that's just it. It's something that it's been reported this way for 40 years, and
Yeah.
nobody, by the way, has ever published a countervailing report. There's all these silly theories. Oh, Trump knows exactly what he's doing. He doesn't actually think trade balances are scorecards. He's just using this rhetoric to get to kind of this madman theory of international diplomacy. Yeah, nobody's actually ever published a report, given whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Washington Post or anybody else. Former Trump officials have never for a second said, yeah, this is all brilliant 3D chess. It's pretty simple. So either it is the best kept secret in the history of international economic policy, or Occam's razor applies, right? That
Right.
it's a pretty simple explanation. And because of that, um, and given that Congress is not likely take back its tariff powers, that it's just broadly delegated to the president. I think we should expect more of this stuff. And then finally,
Mhm.
there is kind of the Hail Mary that the courts will get involved. And there are some lawsuits. And I think, there's a chance that a couple of them might be successful, particularly on the invocation of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which is mainly what Trump has used for the biggest actions, the fentanyl stuff, the reciprocal stuff. So the courts might, maybe, coin toss, get involved there. But the fact is that he's using all these other statutes that are kind of bulletproof, for the courts have basically signed off on. In particular, the national security Section 232 stuff, which is how we got steel and aluminum, and now lumber and copper and autos and semiconductors and pharma. So like, there's still a lot of stuff there. So I think we should expect, a rough patch going forward.
And do you feel like other countries are going to go to China? Like a lot of people have talked about, this is now the Chinese century. Jinsen Huang met with China after being a little burned by the Trump administration.
Yeah,
So how are you thinking about all that?
I do. I think that they maddeningly threw the Chinese government a massive lifeline, because China's economy,
It's
look,
really,
they're doing great stuff in EVs and batteries, but the economy itself
it's really
is a
bad.
mess.
Yeah.
Fighting deflation, tons of overcapacity. This kind of weird Xi is cracking down on private business, and then he's talking up private business, and government control over both social and economic life. I mean, things were not looking good. And global investors were kind of like, you know what, we're gonna look elsewhere for, our investments and our wins. Well, all of a sudden, China's looking pretty good. And if you know how a lot of trade works, it works what we call a gravity model, which really just means big countries tend to attract other countries that are smaller in their orbit. So just like gravity, right? And China is huge. And so if you're Vietnam or, Cambodia or a lot of other countries that are in China's orbit already, and your options are get smacked with a giant tariff in the US, or deal with the CCP. That's terrible, but at least I can deal, right? At least, there's something there. It makes China look a lot better. And then you throw in the fact that China's at the World Trade Organization, acting like the responsible, power, and
Yeah.
talking up globalization. And so all this stuff, and you can kind of laugh at it because we know, I mean, look, the Chinese government does intervene in its economy. It does things that are bad, whether it's on trade policy or human rights and other things. So we can laugh about that, but in kind of, again, it's all relative. And right now, the United States, in a lot of ways, is looking worse, than China. And if so much of investment is just finding the least ugly person, right? And that might be China.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of countries are going that way, which is just shocking. Like, I feel like if you had said all of this half a year ago, people would have been like, "No way!" Like,
Right, exactly. And
right?
and there also is, I think, a third option here, or at least
Oh,
they're not mutually exclusive, but there are other countries that are more aligned with the US in terms of politics and values and that kind of stuff, like New Zealand, for example, they're not going to China hat in hand. They're going to trade with China, Australia too, but instead they're going to Europe and they're going to others and saying, "Hey, we need to create kind of this coalition of liberal democracies as well, using, it's painful to even say, the US negotiated Trans Pacific Partnership as a framework, which is now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans Pacific Partnership, worst trade agreement name ever." And they are, so you're seeing these governments, say, okay, well, we need to just, again, let's move on without the US. Let's kind of form our own club over here, and using, CPTPP as a potential framework.
that is, yeah, it's a wild acronym.
Yeah,
Yeah,
terrible.
TPP was much better.
Yes.
Um, And so like we were talking before we started filming about who this is going to impact, and you mentioned that older people are going to be quite impacted, those who are relying on a fixed income. And you've actually made an argument that there's really no difference between Wall
Yeah.
Street and Main Street. So could
Yeah.
you walk through that? Like, I feel like a lot of people are like, yeah, like Wall Street's getting what it deserves right now. Like, could you talk through maybe how that's not actually the case?
Yeah, look, I mean, you need to separate kind of day-to-day fluctuations in the market and the individuals out there that, hey, God bless them, actually make a living trading every day. The algorithmic folks, the day traders. Hey, good for you. I don't have the stones for that kind of stuff. I would lose my mind in about 5 seconds, but hey, good. For everybody else though, and over a longer term, and I don't even mean years, I mean months. Um, the fact is that Wall Street's actually a pretty good barometer for the U.S. economy. It tends to Wall Street, the S&P's performance and other indices tend to track what's going on in the economy in the real world, right? Whether it's GDP growth or business investment or all sorts of other things, or then negatively correlated with unemployment. So, market goes down, unemployment goes up. So these things, I mean, the market actually does kind of tell us where the U.S. economy has been and is heading. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is there are tens of millions of Americans, and I mean 60+% of all Americans are invested in the stock market. There are pension funds that are dependent. So I mean, even if you don't have a direct, E-Trade account or 401k through your employer, you might have a pension fund that most pension funds are heavily invested in the stock markets. Publicly traded companies there's about 5,000 of them, depending on exactly how you measure it. They have a massive footprint in terms of employment and GDP in their contribution to GDP. So, there's all these different ways that the market actually is the real economy or reflects what's going on in the economy, right? And so we were joking about, which we really shouldn't joke too much, is look, there's a big chunk of the country that is either nearing retirement
Yeah, a
or
big
in
chunk.
retirement, or they're younger but they have like a 529 account and a kid in college, right? So,
Yeah.
if you have, say, let's say you have two college age kids and you have this big chunk of cash in your 529 account so you can pay tuition, and suddenly your 529 account is down 20%. I mean, that's actually, even that is that's a problem. So even younger people can have some exposure there, and so I think it is really just crazy to just say, oh, Wall Street's down, that's good for Main Street, when in reality, it's probably gonna be bad for Main Street in the broader kind of macro sense, but it's also gonna be bad for tens of millions of people as well. And um, let's face it, you work in the political space long enough, you know that it's a lot of CYA in this stuff, right? Just kind of trying to get people off the ledge, because as you surely know, certain market reaction is panic, and so trying to say, remain calm, all is well, even though I think the market is sending pretty clear signals that all is not well.
Well, that tees up perfectly for my last question about the US dollar and
Yeah.
what we're seeing there. And, Trump tweeted out this morning on April 21st that Jerome Powell is like a major loser. The market has sold off, the dollar is still trading down. What are you thinking about the moves that you're seeing in the dollar? And the US is like the safe haven. Is that still a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we haven't broken the emergency glass yet, but we're tapping on it. And this is, I think, the most surprising thing about the market reaction is what's happened in treasuries and with the dollar, because
Yeah.
typically, and if you had asked me in December about what would happen when Trump implemented tariffs, I would say the dollar would strengthen, and you'd probably see, and you would see people flood into treasuries, right? And you're actually seeing the opposite. And that, I think, is a real problem. It's a problem because first, a stronger dollar would mitigate some of the harms, consumer harms of tariffs. Because typically, when you implement tariffs, the domestic currency strengthens for very boring macro reasons. And that can offset some of the consumer harms. Your dollar can go further when you're buying groceries or whatever. When the dollar weakens, it actually is going to amplify the consumer harms. So that's bad for Main Street. And it's also bad for people who are trading in that space, right? But it's a signal that markets and institutional investors think this is fundamentally different, that something in the US is broken and that the US is not a safe haven, and thus that seems to be overwhelming the strengthening aspects. So the dollar, if you were in a world without all these other countervailing considerations, maybe the dollar would be strengthening, and maybe it would be even weaker. But the fact is that because people are exiting the United States, that's why the dollar keeps dropping, and the same seems to be going for treasuries, where people are demanding higher returns on their debt, their purchases of U.S. government debt, and that's also really surprising because in times of turmoil in the past, treasuries were where you went because the U.S. was the safest haven, and now we're seeing that flip, and of course that's going to be bad for mortgages. And this is again going back to kind of how is the market the real economy? Well, that's
Yeah.
going to affect mortgage rates and its credit card rates and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm not a huge pessimist here. I was actually debating this with Jerusalem Demsis over the
Oh,
Atlantic last week.
yeah.
She's great, but
She's
I mean,
amazing.
she's like a doomer now. And I
Oh
said,
yeah, yeah,
look,
yeah,
it
yeah.
can maybe make its way back because you know, eh, but the fact is that eh, the way that our laws are structured gives a single person in the White House a massive amount of control or ability to mess up the economy and to try to rewire supply chains and investment patterns and stuff that have been wired for 30, 40 years when it comes to things like the NAFTA trade agreement, right? So as long as those laws are on the books in the form they're in, and assuming the courts don't get in here, I mean, I do think it makes sense for why folks have, for the time being, not they've moved away from the U.S. as a safe haven. Do I think that this is permanently broken? I don't know. I doubt that. But we're still in like the second inning of a 9 inning game, so I don't want to declare victory or failure that quickly. That a lot can happen.
Yeah, it's like less than 100 days.
Yeah. Yeah,
um,
it feels like 100 years,
yeah,
but it's
it's
literally April.
yeah,
So
I
we
know.
we there's a lot of time left. And the US economy does have a lot of institutional street cred in the sense that
True.
I mean, there's so many decades of the market bouncing back after a period of time, that
Mhm.
the US having a very productive and educated workforce and strong rule of law and all this kind of stuff. So and I always try to mention, even as a trade person, look, the United States is one of the least trade dependent economies on the planet. Trade is a share of our GDP. So you say imports and exports as a share of US GDP, one of the lowest in the world at around
Hmm.
30%. So, there is a lot that can go wrong in the trade environment that won't kill the rest of the economy, right? So for those reasons, you always kind of just say, let's slow down. But of course, do I like what I'm seeing? No, I think it's terrible. I think the policy choices are bad, and I'm certainly going to on Twitter and elsewhere note when these bad things are having bad effects. But I'm also cautioning against being hysterical about it, right? If only for strategic reasons. Because if you're hysterical now and then the worst doesn't happen, then people call you crazy for having been so hysterical. So I try to keep it together as
Yeah.
much as possible. But it doesn't look great.
No, no, it's super. It's almost like stupid, and that's the hardest part. Is it just feels like we're running our head into a wall.
Yeah.
In the next, so this will be my actual final question, but like in the next 100 days, like what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think we're going to get some deals.
Okay, you
I think
do.
yeah, there have to be. So
Sure.
the Trump administration has to show some sort of progress here. I think that being if it's July and there's not a single deal announced, I mean we're trouble. It's a
Sure.
huge problem for them and for us, quite frankly. And I think that some governments, there's a big first mover advantage here, right? You can probably get the best deal if you're one of the first to sign on the dotted line. Even though Trump might rip up whatever you sign, even though you're going to have to make some pretty painful political concessions, there's an incentive on both sides to come to some sort of deal. Now, do I think there's going to be amazing deals that are really comprehensive and broad and covering all sorts of stuff like our traditional trade agreements? No, but are we going to have something that will eliminate some U.S. tariffs, solidify relations with some of our closest trading partners, like Japan being one of the obvious examples? Yeah, I think we will get there, um, but there's no way we're going to get all of them, all these deals done. There's no way that a lot of these tariffs aren't going to stick around. I think at the
Mm,
very least, we're going to see that baseline 10% thing stick around for almost everybody.
oof.
Um, and we're still going to have tons of other known unknowns, right?
Mhm.
where's the semiconductor investigation and the lumber one and the copper one? I mentioned all these others. So I think those are going to be starting to wrap up. I know they're trying to move really quickly. Typically, those take 6 months, but I think they're gonna really push
Wow.
fast because let's face it, the these are all being reversed engineered. It's not like we know that tariffs are coming. They just have to provide a paper trail. So that's coming too. So are we in a better spot in 100 days? I don't know, but I
Mhm.
think I think there are some things that are pretty clear as far as the policy minutia, right?
Okay.
My the way I've said it is I expect market chop for a long while, right? Just it's going to be a roller coaster, and as I said to you before we started, I'm just glad I'm not retiring anytime too soon because
Yeah.
I don't have to look at my 401k and sweat.
Yeah, yeah, long time horizon is definitely like the best asset right now.
Yeah.
Uh,
For you kids out there, just
yeah, hang tight.
just close your eyes.
Right. Oh, thank you so much, Scott. This was super helpful. I'll make sure to link your Twitter and all your work in the description box below so people can follow you because you've been definitely one of the people I've learned the most from over the past couple of months. So thank you for all the hard work.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.